Everyone you meet knows something you don't know. There is a particular kind of person who can walk into a room and somehow make the entire room revolve around them. They need to be noticed. They need to be admired. They need to be right. They need to feel important. And when the attention moves away from them, something inside them begins to collapse. From the outside, they may appear confident, powerful, charming, even extraordinary. But Carl Jung would ask us to look beneath the surface. What if the person who seems to think they are superior is secretly terrified of feeling insignificant? What if the enormous ego is not evidence of enormous strength, but a fragile structure built over an unbearable wound? This is where Jung's psychology becomes fascinating. Jung did not develop the modern clinical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, and we should not pretend that every selfish, arrogant, or difficult person is a narcissist. But his ideas about the ego, persona, shadow, projection, complexes, and psychological inflation give us a profound way to understand narcissistic behavior. He invites us to look beyond the performance and ask a more uncomfortable question. What happens inside a human being when the ego becomes disconnected from the deeper self? Because sometimes arrogance is not strength. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes the person who constantly tells you how special they are is desperately trying to convince themselves. Sometimes the person who cannot tolerate criticism is not protecting a grand identity, but protecting a fragile one. Sometimes the person who must always win is terrified of discovering what they might feel like if they lose. And sometimes the person who looks down on everyone else has spent years running from a part of themselves they cannot bear to see. Jung understood that the human personality is not a single simple thing. We contain contradictions. We contain memories, instincts, fears, desires, dreams, fantasies, wounds, ambitions, and hidden parts of ourselves that we may never consciously acknowledge. The ego is only one part of this enormous psychological world. Yet many people live as though the ego is the entire universe. The ego says, "This is who I am." The deeper psyche quietly asks, "Is that really all you are?" That tension is at the heart of Jungian psychology. To understand narcissistic behavior through Jung's lens, we first have to understand the ego. The ego is the center of conscious awareness. It is the part of you that says, "I." It remembers your story, makes decisions, forms opinions, and navigates the external world. Without an ego, ordinary life would be impossible. We need some stable sense of identity to function. But the ego has a dangerous tendency. It can begin to believe that it is the whole person. And when that happens, psychological inflation can begin. Psychological inflation is what happens when the ego identifies with something larger than itself. A person may identify with intelligence, beauty, wealth, status, morality, success, spirituality, power, or even victimhood. Instead of saying, "I possess certain qualities," the inflated ego begins to say, "These qualities make me superior to other people." The distinction is subtle, but enormous. Healthy confidence says, "I have something valuable to offer." Inflated ego says, "Because I have something valuable, I am more valuable than you." Healthy pride says, "I worked hard for this achievement." Inflated ego says, "My achievement proves that I am exceptional." Healthy self-respect says, "I deserve dignity." Inflated ego says, "I deserve admiration from everyone." And this is where narcissistic behavior can emerge. The inflated ego needs an audience because it cannot sustain itself alone. It needs applause. It needs validation. It needs comparison. It needs someone beneath it and someone above it. It constantly measures itself against the world because it does not possess a stable inner foundation. That is why admiration can become psychologically addictive. The person receives praise and experiences temporary relief. For a moment, they feel powerful, important, desirable, intelligent, successful, or special. But the feeling fades. The ego becomes hungry again. So the person seeks more attention, more praise, more followers, more achievements, more compliments, more evidence that the identity they constructed is real. And this is one of the great tragedies of the inflated ego. It can never say enough. Because the problem was never the amount of admiration. The problem was the emptiness underneath it. Jung believed that what we consciously identify with is only one portion of the psyche. Beneath consciousness exists an enormous unconscious world. Within that world live the things we have forgotten, rejected, suppressed, or never fully understood. And this brings us to one of Jung's most important concepts: the shadow. The shadow is everything we refuse to recognize about ourselves. It is not simply evil. It is not the bad person hiding inside us. The shadow contains whatever the conscious personality has rejected. Sometimes that includes anger, jealousy, selfishness, aggression, sexuality, fear, and insecurity. But it can also contain positive qualities: creativity, independence, confidence, vulnerability, ambition, spontaneity, and emotional sensitivity. A person who has constructed a persona around being endlessly kind may repress their anger. A person who believes they must always be strong may repress vulnerability. A person who desperately wants to appear morally superior may repress their own capacity for selfishness or cruelty. The rejected material does not disappear. It goes underground, and eventually, it finds another way to express itself. This is why Jung famously warned that what we do not make conscious can influence our lives in ways we do not understand. The unconscious does not obey the ego simply because the ego refuses to acknowledge it. For a narcissistically organized personality, this can create an especially powerful split. On one side is the grand persona. Confident, exceptional, superior, successful, desirable, intelligent, morally correct, or uniquely gifted. On the other side is the shadow. Insecure, ashamed, frightened, dependent, ordinary, vulnerable, jealous, wounded, or terrified of rejection. The larger the distance between these two sides, the more energy is required to maintain the illusion. And this is why criticism can become so threatening. A simple criticism may not feel like a simple criticism. To a psychologically fragile ego, criticism can feel like an attack on the entire identity. If someone says, "You made a mistake," the healthy ego can respond, "Yes, I made a mistake." But an inflated ego may hear something much deeper. "You are not exceptional. You are not superior. You are not who you believe you are. You are ordinary." And that can be unbearable. Suddenly, the person who appeared calm becomes furious. The person who seemed powerful becomes defensive. The person who demanded admiration begins attacking the person who offered criticism. This is one reason narcissistic behavior can feel so confusing to others. You may say something small and receive an enormous reaction. You may wonder, why did that affect them so much? From a Jungian perspective, the answer may be that you touched the shadow. You did not create the wound. You touched the place where the wound already existed. This is also where projection becomes important. Projection is one of Jung's most powerful psychological concepts. We often see in other people qualities that actually belong to ourselves but remain unconscious. Instead of recognizing an uncomfortable quality within, we experience it as something belonging entirely to someone else. The jealous person becomes convinced that everyone else is jealous. The dishonest person becomes obsessed with accusing others of dishonesty. The controlling person complains constantly about controlling people. The arrogant person may become hypersensitive to the arrogance of others. The person who cannot tolerate weakness may despise weakness in everyone around them. Projection allows the ego to preserve its preferred self-image. I am not insecure. They are insecure. I am not selfish. They are selfish. I am not seeking attention. Everyone else is obsessed with attention. I am not the problem. Everyone around me is the problem. The psychological trick is powerful because the individual does not necessarily know they are doing it. The projection feels like reality. And this is why arguments with deeply defensive people can become impossible. You are not simply discussing an event. You are threatening an entire psychological structure. The person may not be defending a fact. They may be defending an identity. Jung believed that one of the most difficult tasks in psychological development is learning to recognize our projections. It requires humility. It requires the ability to ask, could some part of what I am seeing in this person also exist within me? That question can be uncomfortable, but it can also be liberating. Because once projection becomes conscious, we reclaim psychological energy. We stop fighting shadows outside ourselves and begin understanding the shadows within. This is part of what Jung meant by becoming conscious. The goal is not to become perfect. The goal is to become whole. And wholeness is impossible when parts of ourselves are locked away. The inflated ego, however, does not want wholeness. It wants superiority. It wants certainty. It wants a clean story. It wants to be the hero. And perhaps one of the most dangerous things about narcissistic inflation is that it can disguise itself as virtue. A person does not always become inflated by saying, "I am better than everyone." Sometimes they say, "I am the only one who truly understands. I am the only honest person here. I am the only one who cares. I am spiritually more evolved. I am more enlightened than everyone else. I am the victim who has suffered more than anyone." The content changes, but the psychological structure can remain similar. The ego discovers an identity that makes it special. Then it becomes attached to that identity. And eventually, the person cannot question it without feeling threatened. Jung was especially interested in this phenomenon because even spirituality can become a source of ego inflation. A person may have a profound spiritual experience and suddenly conclude that they have reached a higher level of consciousness than everyone else. The experience may have been genuine. The interpretation may be inflated. This distinction matters. A person can experience something profound without becoming a profound person. A moment of insight does not automatically create psychological maturity. And Jung knew that the ego can appropriate almost anything. It can even appropriate humility. I am the most humble person in the room. It can appropriate suffering. No one has suffered as much as I have. It can appropriate healing. I am more healed than everyone else. It can appropriate morality. I am a better person than you. The ego is extraordinarily creative when it wants to protect itself. This is why Jungian psychology asks us to go deeper than labels. Instead of simply asking, "Is this person narcissistic?" we can ask, what is happening psychologically beneath this behavior? What identity are they protecting? What feeling are they avoiding? What shadow are they projecting? What wound makes admiration so necessary? What happens when the persona begins to crack? These questions do not excuse harmful behavior. Understanding is not the same as permitting. A person can be wounded and still hurt others. A person can be insecure and still be abusive. A person can have psychological pain and still be responsible for their actions. Jung's psychology does not require us to tolerate destructive behavior simply because we understand where it may come from. In fact, becoming conscious often requires boundaries. One of the deepest lessons of Jungian psychology is that compassion without consciousness can become self-destruction. If you continually rescue someone from the consequences of their behavior, you may be participating in their unconscious pattern. If you constantly reassure someone who demands endless validation, you may temporarily soothe their insecurity without helping them develop an inner foundation. And if you repeatedly sacrifice your own identity to protect someone else's fragile ego, you may slowly lose contact with your own self. This can happen in relationships. You meet someone charismatic. They seem extraordinary. They make you feel special. They tell you that you are different from everyone else. They appear intensely interested in you. Their confidence feels intoxicating. At first, everything seems beautiful. But gradually, something changes. The admiration becomes conditional. You discover that disagreement is dangerous. Their needs become more important than yours. Your emotions are dismissed. Their mistakes become your responsibility. Their failures are blamed on other people. Their image must always be protected. And slowly, you begin walking on eggshells. You start questioning yourself. You ask, am I too sensitive? Did I misunderstand? Maybe I really am the problem. This is where the psychological dynamics of projection and inflation can become destructive. The other person's unresolved shadow begins entering the relationship. And if you are not conscious of what is happening, you may begin carrying emotions that do not belong to you. You become the guilty one, the selfish one, the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the unstable one, the problem. Meanwhile, the other person's idealized self-image remains protected. Jung's psychology gives us an important question in such situations. What is actually mine? That question is powerful. Your feelings are yours. Your responsibilities are yours. Your mistakes are yours. But another person's shame does not automatically belong to you. Another person's anger does not automatically define you. Another person's projection does not become your identity simply because they insist upon it. This is where psychological boundaries become an act of individuation. Individuation means becoming increasingly conscious of who you are beneath the expectations, projections, and roles imposed upon you. And this process can be painful. Because when you stop participating in someone else's psychological drama, they may become angry. When you stop providing endless admiration, they may accuse you of changing. When you stop accepting blame, they may call you selfish. When you begin setting boundaries, they may say you no longer care. But sometimes what looks like rejection is actually differentiation. You are no longer allowing your identity to be controlled by someone else's unconscious needs. And this is important because Jung believed that psychological development requires differentiation. You must become capable of saying, this is me, this is you, this is mine, this is yours, this is what I feel, this is what you feel. Without differentiation, relationships become psychologically fused. And when two people are fused, one person's unresolved shadow can consume the other. This is why Jung believed that relationships often become laboratories for psychological growth. The people who trigger us can reveal parts of ourselves we have not integrated. But there is a crucial distinction. Not every painful relationship is a lesson you must remain inside. Sometimes the lesson is leaving. Sometimes individuation means walking away. Sometimes the most psychologically mature thing you can do is refuse to participate in a destructive pattern. The goal is not to understand someone so perfectly that you tolerate everything they do. The goal is to understand yourself well enough that you stop abandoning yourself. This brings us back to the inflated ego. Why does it become inflated in the first place? There is no single answer. Human psychology is complex. Sometimes grandiosity develops as a defense against deep insecurity. Sometimes it is reinforced by excessive admiration. Sometimes it grows from entitlement, social conditioning, trauma, or environments where status is heavily rewarded. Sometimes it is simply part of a person's enduring personality structure. Jung would resist reducing all of this to one cause: